Hey, everybody, welcome back. It's the book club, back for consideration of our July selection. And I see that we are already joined by Christopher Cokinos, and I'm going to do my best. The trick here, Chris, as I tell people every time, is to catch your name as lots of other people drop in. There, did it. Okay, we should be joined by the guest of honor, Chris Cokinos, in just a couple of moments here. And we will be talking, of course, about this book, Still as Bright, An Illuminating History of the Moon from Antiquity to Tomorrow. Standing behind in the, what do you call it, in the wings, is Amber, supporting us once again. So be sure to get your questions in the chat right here in the book club channel or space. And Amber will forward the very best of those to me. We'll keep an eye on the chat generally as well. And Chris, welcome. You look good there.
Thank you, guys. Good to see you. Can you hear me all right?
I sure can. Looks good,
Great.
sounds good. Great to have you on board. And thank you and congratulations for joining us. But also for the book, I'll hold it up again because we still have people dropping in, and that will continue to grow for a while. There it is.
I've got a copy too, so.
Good, I'm glad. You should have at least one, right, on hand. So I broke with tradition tonight. I don't have a moon tie, because normally I'd be wearing a space tie. And lacking a moon tie, I thought I'd wear my new favorite shirt. It's my Planetary Society bowling shirt, because we all got bowling shirts for the staff retreat a couple of weeks ago, and went bowling, of course, and had a great time. So you can eat your heart out, folks. I don't know if we're going to make these available or not, but I think we probably should.
How did you win, Matt? Did you do well?
You know, I was doing okay in the first game, and then people kind of wandered away, and it broke my concentration, I guess, because in the second game I wasn't nearly as good. But I think I might have rolled that little sphere really, really well if we'd stuck with it. But it was not to be. So we'll talk about a different sphere, the kind that's up in the sky. It's a little pockmarked. The bowling balls that they made available at that alley kind of looked like they'd gone through what the moon has gone through over the billions of years. First, by way of introduction, and there is much, much more that you can read about him on his website, which I suspect Amber will be throwing up here in chat momentarily. It is the place to go to learn much more about Chris and all of the great work that he has done. But just sort of briefly, this is sort of a middling length biography. He has traveled the world. This is right out of it, by the way, with only a little bit of editing. He's traveled the world and beyond it via telescopes. He's the author of, previously, The Fallen Sky, An Intimate History of Shooting Stars, and Hope is the Thing with Feathers, a personal chronicle of vanished birds, both of which published to wide acclaim. He has published 3 collections of poetry and lyric essays. And then, of course, there's Beyond Earth's Edge, the poetry of spaceflight, which he puts in his bio has been featured on Planetary Radio, sure enough, along with those other minor outlets, Scientific American and PBS. And, you know, if you haven't checked it out, here's another one that I'm guessing that Amber will be able to throw up for you. It's a link to the show. There it is, the show that we did with your co-editor, Julie Swarstad Johnson, and you. And we had a space celebrity poetry jam. And it was such fun. We did it back in 2020, I believe. And there is the link if you want to check it out and check out the great lineup of space luminaries that we brought in to read poems right out of the collection. And so, I mean, here it is. If you're curious about it, everyone, I highly recommend it. It really stands at that intersection that we love so much of science and art, that Venn diagram intersection right there. And it is, who published this one?
That was University of Arizona. Yep.
And that's appropriate since you are recently retired from the University of Arizona after also teaching at Kansas State and Utah State. At UA, he taught creative writing, the history of science fiction, and science communication, which is really significant because you mentioned that you mentored over 100 young scientists to become better communicators. What a great service that was. Was that fun?
Oh, I think it was really the teaching that I loved most and could see most immediately the impact because they were already brilliant scientists and scholars, largely in environmental fields, but also ranging into the arts as well, for example, and to see them evolve their speaking styles, their ability to do interviews, their ability to do an elevator pitch, it was wonderful. Yeah, so some of the most gratifying work I've done.
and I know I didn't include them in this bio, but some of them have gone on to do some pretty great work, which must make you very proud and is a great service to science, by the way. I will only mention, in addition to all that, he has stuff published all the time in places like Discover and Astronomy and Sky and Telescope, Space Review, and the LA Times, and has also gotten a journalism fellowship. I mentioned this because I did some stuff for these people, the UCLA Institute of Environment and Sustainability, and I can congratulate you on your poetry prize from the New American Press.
Thank you.
So, good stuff.
Thank you, man. And it's so good to be here. It's always a pleasure to be in conversation with you, Matt. And although I'm watching the chat unfold already, it's just great to spend an evening with you guys. So I look forward to chatting about the moon.
I think I will jump back over to the chat now. Great to see so many of you jumping in, and we will be getting to your stuff as well. Here's what our friend Kim Stanley Robinson says about Still is Bright, an illuminating history of the moon from antiquity to tomorrow. The moon is a strangely challenging subject, but Christopher Cokinos, Cokinos or Cokinos? I've been saying Cokinos for a long time.
That's correct. Yeah, it's Cokinos.
Okay. I thought so. Does a wonderful job revealing both the oldest and latest lunar news and providing insight into the swirl of controversial new activity. People will soon be back on the moon, fingers crossed, and Still is Bright provides a better grasp on the true significance of this. This is also a poetic narrative of moonlit fascination that is a delight to read, with the emphasis on poetic. I loved this monumental book, as did our own beloved colleague, Casey Dreyer, who strongly recommended it to me, even after you had pitched it yourself, Chris. And I don't know if you know this, Casey and I both discovered, because of reading the book, that we'd both been driven by your writing to do something we'd never done before. Both of us have been looking through telescopes at the moon for years. Not once did he or I ever bring out a big moon map and have it sitting next to us while we were looking up at that ad Luna. And you know, of course, that's a big part of the book. You really are, I think you call it a lunar acolyte. I mean, I would call you a Moonie or a moon geek or something.
Yeah,
you
lunatic.
Really, speaking of Kim Stanley Robinson, your descriptions of the moon reminded me of what Stan Robinson wrote in his Mars trilogy, where he made you feel like you were there, rolling thousands of kilometers across the surface of Mars. Your prose, now you have some great illustrations as well, but your prose achieved that for me as well. I hope it did for many of our members who are tuning in. You really know this body.
Thank you. Well, I joke that the book is in part, it's many things, as you know, and this is so fun to talk with people who've at least opened the book as opposed to, you know, a presentation where nobody knows what I'm talking about. But, you know, it's an archive of religion and science. It's a material place, as Galileo gave us that news. It's still fresh news. This is an actual world. And the telescope was really important to me. I think I compared it to, you know, writing a book, for me at least, writing a book about the moon without looking at it carefully would be like writing about birds without birding. So, you know, I had a telescope for a long time, as I tell in the prologue, and I'd never really really, I hadn't gotten the moon map out, and then I did, and I learned its surface. Somebody was just asking about this map in the back. It's not National Geographic. It's a European company, and the name escapes me. But yeah, I think that looking through the telescope and learning the surface of the moon and seeing how sublime and wild and dramatic it is, even though we don't really see change, but the light changes, and trust me, there's a lifetime of observation awaiting anyone who wants to, visit another world. So, and I thank you for that lovely praise. I'm delighted to be in Stan's company in that way. And describing the moon was a challenge, actually. For people who hadn't looked at the moon, it's like, how do I describe this landscape? So.
Before I go on, I have to mention that even though you're a bit younger than me, we have some things in common from our youth. I also sat at the feet of Walter Cronkite as he took us through the Apollo missions, but I also could not wait for the latest Edmund Scientific Catalog, which I treated like holy scripture.
Yes.
I didn't buy a telescope from them as you did, or your family did.
My father did, yeah.
Yeah, but I had a very similar little 2 or 3 inch, I think that's a 3-inch refractor, much like you had, that was not a fine instrument.
Yeah, right. Yeah, a little challenging to use, and therefore a little frustrating, as I learned in my childhood, which is also part of the story. I've graduated to a much better set of telescopes, and then at the end of the book, if you've gotten to it, I won't ruin the ending per se, but I graduate to the 60-inch telescope at Mount Wilson, overlooking the Planetary Society offices in Pasadena. That was an amazing experience. And I just want to say one thing before I forget it, because I've been thinking a little bit about this, getting ready for our conversation tonight. And I say this in the book, and I feel like I ought to write an op-ed or something for Space News, basically pleading for anyone and everyone involved in the lunar economy and planning Artemis and thinking about best practices on the moon, because it's a whole morass of issues for us to think about. Exciting stuff, but there's a lot for us to think about. They should look at the moon through the telescope like that, so it's a place. It's not just a blank spot on a spreadsheet or on a PowerPoint where we're talking about helium-3 or water ice, cracking the water ice into drinking water and rocket fuel, all those things. And I want humans to go back to the moon, but my plea is that people take a look at the moon and really, you don't have to become as crazy as I've become looking at it, but it's sublime, it's wild, it's dramatic. And, Galileo told us that in 1610, when he wrote the Starry Messenger. It's still true today.
Here from your prologue is, I think, a pretty good statement of purpose for the book. Still as Bright is about the moon, about its sublimity, and science and history, its meanings, personal and cultural, about how it can be found let me make sure I got that right, about how it can be for each of us a country of curiosity, discovery, and contented adventure. It has clearly been all of those for you.
Yeah, it has. And, I turned to the moon, at a point in my life, as I think many people do, turning to nature, whether it's birding or rock climbing, or looking through the telescope at a juncture. It could be a low point, it could be, a point in your life where you're at a crossroads. And I was at a sort of personal and professional crossroads in Tucson, which is also part of the theme of the book, is how we treat places and how we overgird them with expectations or fictions. We had a sort of fictional moon for a long time. The real moon apparently didn't quite live up to it for some people, like the Apollo 8 crew. But I turned to, we can talk about that, but I turned to the moon. Yeah, awesome, great. I'm maybe a little hard on them. I don't know. I have great respect for all of the Apollo, all astronauts, right? But I turned to the moon on one evening, as I write about in the prologue, because there it was, and I hadn't looked through my telescope in a long time. And I thought, okay, well, let's just look at this, ball that's up in the sky all the time, that's both too easy because it's always there, and too hard because you pull that moon map out, and there are a lot of craters, there are a lot of names, and it can be a little complicated. And what kind of optics are you using? And is it flipped one way and flipped another way? And I was, never particularly interested in coping with that when I was looking at galaxies, or looking at Mars through my telescope. So turning to the moon has been, life-changing, and, in the way that birding was for me too, sort of having that connection outward and seeing it as a form of solace, a form of contemplation and meditation, but far more than that. The moon is, it's not, as Carl Sagan famously said, of course we love Carl Sagan, but he famously said the moon is boring. I have to disagree, and I hope the book sort of enlivens it for people. Yeah.
I'm especially glad that even after you spent that evening using the 60-inch telescope built by George Ellery Hale, that hero of astronomy, one of, in series, the 4 biggest telescopes in the world that in their time. And I spent a night and a half, one full night and a half night up there once on Ray Bradbury's birthday, looking at Mars when it was passing close. And I'm so sorry that we didn't look at the moon as you did with the 60-inch telescope on Mount Wilson. And we're not giving too much away here, I hope, because hopefully it's a book club. Everybody's read the book club, right? So, but you left that marvelous view through the 60-inch, and it didn't turn you off through looking through your considerably smaller scope.
No, it didn't. And, that experience was spine tingling for me. And, I was with a number of great people at Mount Wilson. And one of my guides for the evening was like, this is the best night we've had. Like, the air was so steady. And so unless you've looked at the moon through the little refractor, the little childhood telescope or my 10-inch telescope or what have you, it's hard to sort of frame that. So that was one of the challenges of writing that chapter, actually, is like how to sort of convey that this very obscure little detail that I've obsessed about, that's been my little holy grail, like I actually saw. But the air is so transparent up there, and of course there's the Los Angeles Light Dome. I just wrote an article for Astronomy on light pollution. The LA Light Dome is pretty awful. Yeah. But the moon is unaffected by that, and so I wanted to see from the the grounds of Mount Wilson again, before and after that experience, what the view was like through my 10-inch telescope. So it was a culminating experience to go to Mount Wilson, and it's just an amazing, hallowed place. But there's, my telescope's over in the corner here. You can't see it, but I'm getting it out. There's a lot for me to look at on that sublime celestial companion of ours.
And then, of course, I mentioned the great illustrations in the book, going way, way back to the early drawings through the beautiful photographs that we now get. Like from Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. Yeah. Oh my goodness. But that. And I should mention that photo, it's from Lunar Orbiter 2, I think, of Copernicus, right. The one at the oblique angle, which really puts you in the scene. This is before the Earthrise image 2 years later from the guys on Apollo 8. There's just something about looking through a telescope, even if it can't compare with a photo from a spacecraft or an astronaut who's been there. There's just something about having that light come right into your eye.
Exactly, and there's a duality. There's a kind of double groundedness, at least when you're looking at the moon, and maybe a little bit when you're looking at Mars, because you can see surface details on Mars with the 2 bodies that we can see surface details on. The moon, of course, is so much more vivid, and so I have the sense in writing the book, and I have this sense looking through the telescope still and for the rest of my life, of being rooted where I am, whether it was in Kansas, 25 years ago, looking for a galaxy, or in my new backyard here, back in Logan, Utah, where we used to live and we've moved back to and into a different house. The sense of home, the sense of connection to the earth as a celestial body with its sounds and its textures and its smells, and that's part of the, I think, Yeah, it's part of what I find so gratifying about stargazing. And I understand, of course, like astrophotographers, people who are using remote observatories, a different sort of angle, of course. And Barbara Cohen, who was a colleague from years ago when we were in Antarctica collecting meteorites, she is a lunar scientist, and we've talked about this, and she likes to look at those lunar reconnaissance orbiter photos, which are so precise and so defined, and zoom in on the screen and, you know, see the Apollo remnants and so forth. And I think there's a place for all of that. But I agree that being outside in the place where you live with a telescope is a transformative experience, and it's a sustaining experience. You're learning the sky and you're learning your own ground. And if you set up the telescope, as I do sometimes, in a public place outside a bookshop in Salt Lake City, people come over, you know, it's like, you know, and you show them the moon. And if they haven't seen it through a telescope, they have that exclamation of, oh my God, you know, in children sort of, you know, having that beautiful scream of delight. And I don't find that terrain. I mean, I probably don't scream with delight that often when I'm looking at the moon anymore, in part because our neighbors are close by. But I do have, you know, if I see something I haven't seen before, or see some nuance that I haven't seen before, it's very satisfying. And again, you don't have to own a telescope, for example. You know, you can borrow one. There are about 1,000 public libraries that have telescopes. So I would encourage people to check librarytelescope.org, I believe, is the website, or you could just Google that and you'll find it. And yeah, and so you can have that experience. You don't have to go, you know, go down the lunar rabbit hole as much as I have. But it's a beautiful celestial companion that has played this outsized role in the evolution of the Earth, in the evolution of our species, and maybe with Artemis and the Chinese return to the, you know, Chinese effort to get to the moon, it could well have an important role for us in the future. So,
and I wasn't going to bring this up, but by the way, I'm also pleased that at least one other fan of the moon and astronomical observing doesn't see the man in the moon. The rabbit, sure, I can see Chang'e's rabbit, but I've never seen the man in the moon. And I think you said you haven't either?
Yeah, that's true. I can see it now, especially Ewan Whitaker, who is a lunar astronomer at the University of Arizona, has a book that I relied on as a great scholarly source, and he has sort of highlighted, or I should say darkened, Maria, the big spots that we see. The Maria is the Latin for seas, that the ancients thought those were actual oceans. And so those combinations create those shapes that are the cross-cultural part of the story of the book, as you know, is like this vast, diverse global mythology and religious significance, even still today, of course, of the moon. But yes, the man in the moon has always been hard for me to see. Mostly I see a poodle now. And so that's, you know, maybe a little deflating, but it's also kind of amusing. So
I think I'll stick with the bunny. I don't even think I want to see the man in the moon. And we're going to come back to a lot of these themes, like the cultural significance of the moon and so on, assuming we have time. And we're doing pretty well here. Those of you who've just joined us, of course, we are talking to Chris Cokinos, the author of Still Is Bright, and I'm glad you've joined us. And if you are not watching us live, you may not even be a member of the Planetary Society. If you were a member, you could be part of our member community and watch it live and actually participate, feed us questions like the one that I'm about to give you, Chris. Okay. But we encourage you, if you're seeing this on our YouTube channel or on our website, consider becoming part of the society. We would love to have you on board and have you join the party. So, having said that, first I want to mention Mark Dunning, who says, sweet shirt. Thank you, Mark. I think so, too. But here's one that Amber has passed along from Gerard Bedouin, or Baudouin. I'm sorry, Gerard. I hope that's somewhat close to the pronunciation. He says, you mentioned, Chris, the overview effect briefly from our friend Frank. Can you expand on the real differences in the experiences between humans seeing an Earth without boundaries from low Earth orbit and those that humans have experienced, who have experienced the moon as a place?
Wow, that's a very
big
question. question. We could spend a long time talking about that.
Yeah.
Let me take a stab at this. I think, and then, of course, I know Frank White's work, and I think that I would call it the overview experience. First of all,
you comment on in the book. You say,
yeah,
maybe there's something to it, but you also know a lot of astronauts who are not the greatest people, and yeah.
And maybe, so maybe that experience hasn't carried forward in the ways that we often think that it might, with calling it the overview effect. There is I will try to answer the question, but getting to this notion of the sublime, that sense of being overtaken by something much bigger and grander, whether it's a mountain range or the Earth seen from low Earth orbit. These experiences are real. They are culturally inflected. There's been really interesting research on Western differences in Western experiences of the sublime, which tend to be individuals in nature versus, say, in China, where it's more communal and it's more social, and it's seeing people doing things. So there's a lot to wrap your arms around. And I think that the experience of seeing the Earth, I mean, we would all like to do this, right? I would love to see the Earth from space. And I imagine it would just reinforce my sense of what the sublime is. And I hope then, as it clearly has become for many of the astronauts, an ethical sort of compass, a sense of this is a fragile planet. But then also we can do two things at once. We can protect the Earth, we can steward the Earth, we can have a vibrant future here, we can work out and solve our problems, and we can go to space, and those things are mutually compatible. So the second part of the question then, if I'm remembering now, is the experience of seeing the moon, the astronauts seeing the moon. And it's an interesting story. And in brief, the first humans to visit the moon were awed by it. There's when you read the flight transcripts, it's clear. I mean, they're shocked. I think that Bill Anders is the first one to see the peaks of the moon outlined against the starry sky, and he just says, "Oh my God!" and scares Frank Borman, the commander of Apollo 8. But they didn't have the kind of heavily scientific training that the later crews had, starting with Apollo 15, and some of the it's in the book. Some of the language that's used is pejorative, and the moon becomes boring after a while. And I can understand, there's a lot of holes in the moon. But if you have that moon map, and if you have that sense of perspective and history, and if you have that scientific training that the Apollo 15 crew in 16 and 17 had, the moon is a very different experience. And the experience of Apollo 15, which is a mission I am deeply fascinated with, they all talk about the moon as a kind of home, whether it was Al Worden in orbit, seeing the moon and knowing it so well because of Farouk Albaz's training, his mentor, his geology mentor, and Dave Scott and Jim Irwin there, comparing the surface of the moon, that they're at the base of the massive hulking Apennine Mountains, these very muscular, very tall mountains, 15 to 18,000 feet, and seeing a kind of Western landscape. Like this reminds, I think, Jim Irwin of Sun Valley in winter. So we bring those, terrestrial, we always have to, right? We always will. We're hardwired to do metaphor and to bring experiences from one place to another. What I hope is that those experiences, whether you're seeing the Earth from orbit or you're seeing the moon up close, in orbit there or on the surface, that you can have a kind of standpoint where you let it fill you. And I think, weirdly, the more information you have about something, the more likely that can happen. There's a scholar that I talked to, it's called the thick sublime. Like, I know a lot about the Grand Canyon, say. I will experience it very differently from just stopping and having a postcard view, which can be great. But
I appreciate Impressionist paintings much more when I know a little bit about how that movement came about, and about the artists who created the work. I think it's exactly the same.
Yeah, exactly. And you're hearing a professor talk about this. So, like, knowledge, we need to know things. But I do think it's the difference between, it's the Walt Whitman poem I used to have memorized, where he hears the astronomy lecture. I
just quoted it last week in Chicago at the Ravinia Festival, The Learned Astronomer.
The Learned Astronomer.
And we love Walt Whitman, but that poem doesn't get it.
No, he doesn't. He's basically It may have been a boring lecture. That's fine. Okay, maybe the lecture was
It
boring,
happens.
but astronomy builds knowledge in these ways. Yeah, it uses numbers, Walt. That's okay. We learn from that, and we bring that to our experiences, whether we're in orbit or grounded here on Earth.
You mentioned Al Worden, who would become a poet. And, other guys like Michael Collins and Alan Bean became damn fine artists.
Yes, indeed.
Even Buzz Aldrin sort of approaching the poetic with his magnificent desolation. What a great phrase. I love it.
Yeah.
And Nicole Stott, who I was with last week at the Ravinia Festival, hasn't gotten to go to the moon yet, but she did live high above the Earth and, was the first to use watercolors in space. And she was very pleased when I told her last week that you had mentioned her in the book because of that.
Nice.
And even, Jim Lovell, who maybe didn't appreciate it that much at first, Jim Lovell actually came to the concert at the Ravinia Festival near Chicago last week. He was incognito. He was with his family, children and grandchildren, with glasses and a hat pulled down. I didn't get to meet him, but he was there on the grass, 96 or 97 years old now. I think he also, to some degree, came around, right?
I think so, and I think that the experience clearly marks individuals, and and Lovell goes back, right? Apollo 13, and he has a greater chance to sort of and he did respond of the Apollo 8 crew. It's Lovell, and I point this out in the book. It's Lovell who has more of a kind of explorer's sensibility through the duration of the mission. And I agree with you, and I think that does carry forward. And one of the maybe a slightly adjacent topic, I wrote a piece for Esquire on the arts and an analog lunar mission I did at a facility near Biosphere 2. I firmly believe that bringing artists into the mix to actually help astronauts express those experiences would be a wonderful thing. I may be a Sisyphean task. I don't know if anybody's going to listen to that, but all those people too, there's Alexei Leonov as well. There's Don Pettit, who's taking these amazing photographs. My friend Michael Soluri, the photographer who helps some shuttle crews practice their photography. I would love to see more of that integrated as we, as I'm putting it in a proposal, I hope to put forward to the powers that be, putting the art in Artemis.
That's great. I love that. Talk about an elevator speech. Yeah. And Leonov, the man who, if things had been a little different, might have been the first person on the moon. Here is another question from Victor Pimalis. Despite it being disheartening, I was very appreciative to learn about NASA's connection to Nazi engineers, which was a chapter, just because our time is limited, I wasn't going to spend much time on. It seemed like you were disappointed by how difficult it was to find this history readily available online. How important do you think it is that we know the full story of getting to the moon? Well, to me, from that chapter, you think it's very important that we keep this in mind, even as we triumph.
Yes. Yeah, I do. And I feel it was an obsession when I learned to tell the story of going to this kind of out of the way Air and Space Museum that this audience probably knows, the Cosmosphere in Hutchinson, Kansas, which has done restoration work. It's a really terrific museum. And they had have a really unstinting look at this subject and the moral compromises of Wernher von Braun in particular. Michael Neufeld's work on this is crucial. I would point people to a book of his called The Rocket and the Reich, his biography of von Braun, and a number of other writers, Brian Krim, several, Monica Laney, who have written about this now, but it hasn't quite seeped out into popular culture. And going to the Kennedy Space Center again, and I say this as someone who wants humans to be on the Earth and in space and on the moon and on Mars, that we have a multi-planetary, vibrant, just future, we can do this. I think it's important to acknowledge the costs and the compromises and the crimes. The origins of modern rocketry are with the V2 missile that killed, 5,000 people and killed about 15 to 20,000 slave laborers. And von Braun made choices. And I think it's important to just hold that as part of that moral compass that the moon, in a sense, provides. Yeah, and that its history provides.
Great answer. Thank you, Victor, for the question. I'm going to read, with your indulgence.
Sure.
It's kind of a long bit here, but I think it's such a great example of the really fine writing that you did in creating this book. It's just one of many passages that has stuck with me. For in the shadows and highlights, we perceive something more than harsh reality, an indefinable something caught on the edge of things that is as revelatory of the man as the moon world itself. Intangible it may be, but it cloaks the scars of a violent past with a mystique as telling as any physical discovery, reminding us of the excitement which awaits those who embark on a personal journey of discovery and exploration. The sun shining on that surface throws not just crater rims into relief, but the deepest questions about purpose, time, and acceptance. Such questions that tend to rise from the plains in the second halves of our lives and that encourage exploration of why humans quest at all. Although astronomer Fred Price claims in the Moon Observer's Handbook that, quote, personal cares and problems are best not brought to the telescope, those sent me to the moon, where I could fly with my eyepieces and walk with my maps, where I would get lost less often. Beautiful stuff.
Thank you.
So
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. You say in chapter 1, to be aware of time is to be aware. Maybe I didn't copy it correctly. Boy, I'm having trouble with quotes today. To be aware of time is to be aware of, I think, of being a self in a larger reality. I assume you know the line I'm talking about, even if I've mangled it. What did you mean by that? Can you expand on that?
Well, I think one of the things that, yes, I'll try. I think one of the things that surprised me in writing about the book, there were several, surprises, and that's Robert Frost says no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. So I was glad to, have some gifts of I hope insight, or at least new information, and the role of the moon in timekeeping. Of course, we kept track of the phases of the moon. Okay, whatever. Well, the archaeoastronomy angle here is important, and so to think about our ability, as a species, our ability to track time is to understand our relationship with the moon. And it was pre-Western science, but it was science. It was empirical, and it was all across the globe, because this was the way, at least at certain latitudes on the Earth, to bridge between seasons and days, right? And the moon's very complicated. Like where it shows up in the sky, I actually have to check a website. Okay, I have a rough sense of the time of year, where I'm going to see it, but it moves around a lot, and those motions are complicated. And ancient cultures, pre-literate, in quotation marks, pre-literate cultures, did a lot of, serious observing and understood that. And so I agree with Alexander Marshak. I quote in that first chapter about time, as an independent scholar in the 1960s, who really argues for the moon's role in not just the practicality of timekeeping, but giving our species at least the chance to, and I think he says, we took that chance, and I agree, that opportunity to understand mortality. The moon rises, it gets brighter, it rises, it gets full, and then it starts to wane, and it's less and less, and then it's gone. Right. We are aware of ourselves in time, and I would just say this, Matt, like we're in a culture where we're time obsessed, right? Zoom time, work time, market time, stock market time, the news cycle, the 15-minute news cycle. Andrew Warhol would be thrilled with that. Like we're steeped in it, but we are also completely oblivious to the flow of time in the way that most of our species has experienced it for most of our time, right? Most of our time on this planet. That is part of our crisis right now. Anyway, that's my little soapbox on that.
And I would say, in the age of TikTok, maybe 15 seconds of fame.
Yeah, 15 seconds.
And the quote that comes to mind as you describe this, also from the book: "The moon gave birth to death, and death gave birth to everything else, everything human, that is, from self-awareness to religion, from tribal and political affiliation to art." Mm-hmm. Also very perceptive. Yeah.
It's right at the origin of who we are as a species, and I think that for me, as we look to go to the moon, it's also a material place, right? Galileo showed us it's not just a light in the sky. It's a place. It's a world. We have a mixed history on this planet of attitudes and treatment of places, whether they're whether humans are living there or not. There's apparently no life on the moon, as it turns out, much to the disappointment of 19th century astronomers, at least some of them. But having that sense of the importance of the moon for us as a species, at the origin of who we are, I think should cultivate some humility and a sense of respect and stewardship for, this object that without which we probably wouldn't be here, actually, without the moon. So.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of speculation that indicates that. I also, many years ago, was in China, the only time I've been there, during the Moon Festival, the Autumn Moon Festival. Nice. And it was just lovely, absolutely lovely. Everyone out on the street at night, hoping to take a look up in the sky at the moon and eating mooncakes. And
mooncakes are so good, right?
They really are, yeah. You got to avoid the ones that have fungus growing inside them. There were a few of those being sold on the street, but basically, yes, delicious. And it was such fun. It was so wonderful to get swept up in this cultural event, all-encompassing cultural event that was all about looking up at this companion in the sky.
Yeah, I would love to see that sort of replicated in our culture as well. And I think really the closest thing we have, unless of course you're in a place with a Chinese community where you can experience that, is International Observe the Moon Night, which a plug for that. And there's Global Moon Day that's just been started by the Moon Village Association. If people are interested, the Moon Village Association, which is based in Europe, really interesting group doing some policy work, but cultural engagement as well. And then NASA's International Observe the Moon Night, which is growing in popularity. Not, I don't know if they're selling mooncakes on NASA's website yet, but there are events all over the place for International Observe the Moon Night, and it happens in the fall. So.
Maybe the Planetary Society can jump in on that, corner the mooncake market. By the way, Victor, who we just heard from, said, "I learned so much reading this book. I enjoyed it very much." Jean Lewin, another person who a regular with us in the book club, "I just wanted to pass on the poetic style writing by Chris elicited many emotions. I was very moved by your work. Thank you for sharing your life," which of course you do a great deal of in this book. Thank you. I loved your mention of Moonwatcher, who, readers of the book 2001: A Space Odyssey know that that's the name of the proto-human who we see in the movie, who is sort of helped in a little bit to discover tools, but also sits out in the evening at the edge of the cave, the mouth of the cave, and looks up at the moon.
What's up?
And in the book, reaches for it and then thinks to himself, "Oh, I just need to find a tall enough tree."
Which we're doing.
Yes.
And then we could have Casey and others join us to talk about the Space Launch System, if that's the tallest tree to get to the moon or not. But
you appear to admire Galileo, not just for inventing science, more or less, and turning a spyglass toward the heavens, but also for the descriptions that he provided of what he saw up there, including the Galilean moons as we know them now, but the moon, our own moon.
Yeah, I have a few heroes, and he is one of them. And I think that we should all, maybe, The Starry Messenger might be a good book to
Galileo's book,
I mean, it'd be hard to get him on Zoom, but it's a we could find an actor, but it's a beautiful book, and I looked at a copy at the University of Arizona Special Collections that apparently he owned. That was quite moving. There was some, little marginalia that looked to be like his handwriting. But just reading that prose, and he starts with the moon, and I don't have the quotes in front of me. So, but I would just say, you find them in my book, or read the Starry Message. It's not a long book, but there is this vividness still to his sense of discovery, and it bears repeating that what he does with this, he's not just pointing a telescope at the moon, because now we know what that means. No one knew what that meant, right? Even Galileo didn't really know what that would mean. Kepler had looked at the moon with the naked eye, and he was seeming to detect some hints of terrain. But this was a light in the sky, and it was a deity, and it was a perfect philosophical circle. And the big problem was how to understand why it's has these blue spots, and so maybe it's of various thicknesses, but he takes this technology, and he did not invent the telescope, but he made the best telescope in the world at that time, and he looks at this object in the sky and infers terrain. He doesn't necessarily see the craters in the sense that we see them, but he sees light and shadow. He understands, because he had training as an artist, he understood perspective. This was very clearly a landscape. That was earth-shattering. That was groundbreaking. That, to use all trailblazing, all the cliches that we use. And he did invent science, and or at least was part of that, a huge part of that, because he took it, an extension of human senses, and looked at something that we thought we knew what it was. At least most people thought they knew what it was, and it turns out not at all. It's not perfectly smooth. It's not sort of philosopher's perfect sphere. It is a place, and as a place, then it's someplace, if we have a tall enough tree, we can get to it. So Galileo changes everything. And whenever I look at the moon during a certain phase early on, I look for some of the craters that he drew in the Starry Messenger. And those drawings are still incredibly beautiful.
There are a couple of other guys who lived long after Galileo, but they were contemporaries. And you kind of wove them together, these two outstanding characters. Talk about H.G. Wells and W.H. Pickering.
Oh, W.H. Pickering, yeah. So, well, H.G. Wells will be a name familiar to many of us, right? And a science fiction writer. Well, let's say that actually he said he wrote scientific romances. That's what he called it. And, really sort of brings the genre into a kind of contemporary, and now I would say timeless way of understanding it, and different from Jules Verne, who was interesting, but I would say Verne was a writer of blueprints with verbs. I mean, it was just, the Wells had a much bigger sense. By the way, I'm also obsessed with H.G. Wells. I don't have it here in my study, but in my bedroom, I have a complete set of everything he's published, from The Time Machine to 1924, and he still has like 25 more years worth of work. So Wells is a really fascinating character.
Are you a fan of the movie Things to Come? It's quite an amazing film.
Yes, it's an amazing film. The slightly fascist approach to the control over it. It's a little concerning. The technocrats take over. Yeah. H.G. Wells writes First Man in the Moon, and has these incredible descriptions of a sunrise on the moon that brings these, sort of dormant desert-like plants to life that sort of come out, and they're observing this through the sort of cloudy glass of their capsule that left the Earth because of a substance called cavorite, which is an anti-gravity substance. And T.S. Eliot, the great modernist poet, was deeply impressed by this description. H.G. Wells was huge. Okay, he was a big deal from The Time Machine up until the mid 20s, and so this book was an influence. I can't quite tell it, sort of contemporary influences, but W.H. Pickering, who was an astronomer who was convinced the last astronomer of some note to argue that the moon had life on it. And, he recognized the hostile conditions enough to say, well, it would be like, vegetation at the base of a crater where water is seeping out. But he claimed to have observed the migration of insects across a crater. He claimed to see blizzards on tops of these mountains in the middle of craters. It's very romantic, completely misguided, and he was very cantankerous and unforgiving of the many people who thought he was a complete, nut job. And it turns out he was wrong on all these counts, overlooking the fact that he was also a great observer and he discovered a lot of things on the moon. So that sense of wanting the moon to be alive begins right after Galileo. If it's a world, it's a place. God would not waste a planet. There has to be life on the moon. Well, there's water now. We know that in the form of water ice. If there are any microbes, they're long gone.
Yeah. Except for the ones that we may have dropped off in our visits.
Yes, good point. Yeah.
Here's something from Larry Shaw, which Amber says, not really a question, just nice comments. Larry said, I'm a Luna neophyte. This book has awakened a thirst to know more and experience more. Thank you for this great book. From Jacqueline Marie Martin, an amazing read, such talent. I love the journey from cover to cover.
Well, you guys are great. That's just so sweet. It's really lovely to talk with people who've actually, have read the book. I've gotten some very nice notes from other readers and from some scientists and astronomers, and some corrections from a historian as well, which would be from Michael Neufeld. We were talking about the von Braun chapter, and he knows that material so well. So the ebook will have some changes in there, and I would just say, if you see anything I got wrong, let me know, because I want to fix it. So, but I did try to be, as assiduous as possible with all that material. So
you cover so much. There's such a breadth of topics. I don't know what's left to say about the moon, although I think probably people will find something, right? What are the places you'd most like to visit? I know you mentioned what you think is the most beautiful feature of the moon, right? Hadley Rill?
Hadley Rill, yeah. I love that question. One of the things that you can, I will answer it, but when I want to say this is another plug for looking at the moon through the telescope and having a little bit of knowledge of the surface features, not just with the map, but, I read a lot of the literature of the 19th century. The 19th century was the sort of pre-Apollo lunar exploration era, where these telescopists, as they would call themselves, would spend hours looking at the moon, right? And mapping it and finding features and naming them, and then arguing about, did this crater disappear or not disappear? Their dedication. And there's a passage in one of those books by James Naismith, who's a wonderful writer. And he has this, long passage where he talks about it's, basically inevitable if you spend time looking at the moon in solitude through a telescope. You will imagine yourself, although it would be impossible, to be on the surface, right? And to, as he puts it, to become in thought a lunar being. And I just love that. And I do that as frequently as possible. Yes, the base of the Apennine Mountains by Hadley Rill would be incredible. But I also look at a place like Copernicus or Tycho, where you have those dramatic terraced rims because of how the cratering mechanism happens. It's another story in the book, like how we get to understand how craters form. When now we know impact, right? You get these complex shapes, and then you get the rebound in the middle, and you get the central peak. Take a look at the central peak of Tycho on the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter Camera Archive website. It's easy to find. Or just Google it. You'll find it. There's a boulder the size of your house on the top of that mountain. And that would be a view. Like, I would love to be on the central peak in Tycho, right? There are very few places on the moon I wouldn't want to go. If somebody wants to take me, just drop me for 2 or 3 weeks. I'll be happy. Yes.
Can I go? I'll be happy.
Yeah, no. Let's do it. The Dear Moon mission was canceled by the Japanese billionaires, so I think we'll have to get Bill Nye to shake the money tree somehow and send all the members of the Planetary Society there.
Yeah, if you're listening, Elon, you've got a ready-made, enthusiastic crowd. I haven't read this over, but it's a comment from Gene Lewin, in addition to what we read from him earlier, and it might be in step with what we're talking about at the moment. He says it's still hard to imagine the time needed for early astronomers to record their observations, not to mention the early drawings of the lunar surface being accomplished in the dark. Granted, some of the observations were a bit exaggerated, but added to the fun and showed some imagination that may have inspired some science fiction authors. Boy, we could spend another half hour talking about this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, and here in writing the book, I was really grateful to William Sheehan and Thomas Dobbins, who are two really excellent writers. You'll see them often in, say, Sky and Telescope, and they've written a lot about astronomical observational history. And they have a wonderful, if you really want to get into it, it's a book called Epic Moon, and it's about this era of looking through the moon from Galileo up, prior to Apollo, where the telescope was how we got there. And, these astronomers in the 18th and 19th century are working outside with, primitive equipment. Some of them have telescopes that are basically like, the mirrors or the lenses are separated by ropes, by drawstrings, and the slightest wind will shake the image, and they're out there for hours. It's cold. They're working hard mathematically, they're drawing, they're trying to sort of understand what they're seeing. Some of them go blind. It's an amazing, sort of lesson in the dedication that they had. And I do, I agree. And I think that the especially those images of the sharp peaks of the moon, even this is part of the story that maybe leads a little bit into Apollo 8. The sense that the moon had to be alpine, it had to be, like the Sawtooth Mountains or the Himalayas or the Alps, right? And it's absolutely not that. And Chesley Bonestell, the famous space artist, he knows that it's not this, it's not the edge of a saw, it's rounded. And he's preceded by an artist named Lucien Rudeau, a French artist who paints and draws the moon more realistically. So that just comes back to that sense of like, what are we bringing to it? Are we wanting it to be a certain thing for us? And I try to make this plea, and in a sense, just talking to myself, like, take the place where you are on its own terms as much as you can.
Just a couple of comments and a question maybe from Dave Ginsburg, who apparently met Dave Scott, who said that they really should send an artist to the moon. We've heard that from a lot of people.
Yes, they should.
And then Dave also wants to know, and it's something I asked him about when we were testing, what's the movie poster, which is a little bit in the dark.
Yeah, a little bit in the dark right now. I don't want to move the light around too much. We'll have some sort of like solar flare that will happen here in my now darkening moon study. But I showed Matt this yesterday or the day before. This is, you can look up the image. I'm sure it's online. Of course, it's the Belgian poster for Conquest of Space, the George Pal movie. I don't remember what year, 52, 53, something.
I thought it was late 50s, but maybe
late 50s. Sure. Yeah, it's after Destination Moon. It's a really bad movie and wonderful to watch at the same time. But yeah, it's Conquest of Space, and the title is in French at the top, and then a little English subtitle, and then at the bottom it's in German. So I went through a little phase of collecting science fiction movie posters until my wife said we were running out of space. And we have. I'm literally hanging posters in my bedroom closet. That's where we are now. So, yeah.
Dedicated moon geek and space geek. We are coming up on the hour. We always say this is going to be an hour, and then we almost always go a bit beyond. Is that okay with you, Chris?
I'm fine, man. I had dinner before we got on, and I love talking with you as always, Matt, and happy to keep going. As long as folks want to go, 45, 46 people with us. It's fantastic.
Yeah, and more to come, because we always hear from people who say, "Oh shoot, I can't join you live. I'll be there later." And now, of course, all the folks will pick up, because we will be making it public on YouTube. So if you're watching us there, again, welcome.
And just to say, I love this. Matt, of course, we all know is the former host of and long legendary host of Planetary Radio, and it's just so sweet and wonderful that you're doing this book club. I love it, and it's just so. Hats off to you.
Thank you. Long held dream. We talked about it for years. Never had time to do it. Now I do.
No, you do.
I want to take you back to the book, and we're in chapter 10, titled "A Meaning." Which it's too long to read, but the opening of that chapter is another one of those wonderful passages which I encourage people to take a look at. It follows a few short lines from Archibald MacLeish's poem Voyage to the Moon, which is where you get the chapter title. And here it is: a light beyond our lights, our lives perhaps, a meaning to us. Oh, a meaning. And you close your opening lines at the top of that chapter with the moon rises and sets, waxes and wanes, and we are free to allegorize and harmonize all we want, which kind of goes back to what you were telling us about the great Chesley Bonestell.
Yeah, indeed. And so here is the moon as this muse for artists of all kinds, and we'll never stop being that, even if we have an industrial infrastructure at the lunar South Pole, and if we do, I hope it isn't, I hope it looks okay. I hope they have some designers and architects make it look better than we usually make these things look.
Yeah.
And by the way, as a little final gift to myself after the book came out, I purchased a broadside, a printed, about this size, broadside of the Archibald MacLeish poem that was printed at the time. It was published in the New York Times. He has 2 or 3 different versions, but it's signed by the poet. So you can't see it, but it's in the back over here. So I feel a sense of kinship with that poem. And yeah.
I think that we need to go live someday in your home with a tour of your collection. That'd be fun. I would enjoy that. This chapter about all this inspiration that the moon has provided. It's also the one in which you describe your visit to Florida to see a launch and being out there in a kayak, which I envy you greatly. I've kayaked a little bit in the Everglades, but not right off of the Kennedy Space Center. And yet, it made me think of the phrase fear and loathing on the Space Coast, because parts of it are really pretty tacky, aren't they?
Yeah, it is. It was my first trip there, which I'm still sort of amazed that it took me that long as a kid who grew up tape recording Skylab, missions and playing the tapes back in the dark in our little trailer in Indianapolis, and having this renewed interest in astronomy. And, it's in my early 30s, I started sort of coming back to the night sky again. And then, this book and thinking about space exploration, the inspiration of it, and the passion, beauty, and joy, right?
PB&J.
Yeah, the perils and the difficulties and the challenges and the conversations that we have to have. And so that trip to Florida with Von Braun very much in mind, I very deliberately stayed at the motel in Cocoa Beach called the Sea Air, where he
in his room.
Right? I am told in his room, but they all may be his room. I don't know, but it seemed it was the best, absolutely the best room from as far as a view and so forth. But it's an interesting story and development. Casey Dreyer was talking with Brian Odom about the American South and NASA and the development patterns that happen around and the racial segregation and employment issues, and how NASA actually was kind of at the tip of the spear in terms of trying to equalize job opportunities across the racial divide, and not always successfully, but all of which is to say that the area around the Space Coast area is a real mishmash of and it's a difficult environment, and it's one of those things too where I feel like I might have been a little too hard in my descriptions at times, and
it seemed pretty accurate to me, actually. But
sort of reflecting and embodying how I felt there. That was actually the launch where I think I met you and Casey for the first time. That was the first attempt for the space for Artemis 1, the space launch system.
Yep.
Yeah, and then watched it at home on my TV instead of from the kayak. So
still fun, always a fun place to go. By the way, I love to tell the story of the first time I was at a KSC, or at least out at the launch area, and sat through 3 scrubs of space shuttle launches, so I never got to see one. But we did knock on the door for the little 2-story ramshackle CBS news headquarters, and there was one tech there who let me go upstairs and sit in, like you were in Werner von Braun's room. I told myself, this is Walter Cronkite's chair.
Oh my God.
And, oh my, it was almost over.
That is a lovely story. I did not know that story. And I'm just like, I am touched by that. Just to circle back to that sense of, going to a place and almost literally touching history. That's something that I find really moving. It's part of my MO as a writer. And I don't know quite sure where that came from, but it's something I love to do. It was part of when I wrote my first nonfiction book about extinct birds, like going to the places where they were and so forth. But one of the stories that did not make it into the book, and I think this is the first time I've talked about this, I was in Huntsville to see the Marshall Space Flight Center and to go to space camp, adult space camp.
Yep.
Apparently I graduated, I survived, I made it back from orbit. And I was driving around Huntsville, and I had the address of von Braun's second house, the house that he had built there, and the current owners had it for sale, and they were there. It was open, so I just sort of said, "Can I come through?" So I walked through von Braun's house and walked into the backyard, and there was the bomb shelter that he had built, much to the consternation of his neighbors. So. Wow. I couldn't find a way to get that into the book, but it was really cool, actually.
But these personal adventures of yours are such a cool personal angle on the book. I think that there is a warrant for your arrest for trespass in France.
Yes, in France. Yes, there is. Yes,
you went on to that estate, the Fontenelle estate, was it?
Yes.
I also have to ask, what is up with the dead frog soup?
That was my attempt at ritual magic, of trying to get into the mindset of the witch, as it were, and sort of tapping into the powers of the moon, right? So we're talking about folklore and mythology and the sort of spiritual and religious powers that the moon has for many people. Well, I'm a materialist. I'm a sort of science-driven person, and it felt important to me to just try this on. And it turned out to be fairly gross ritual with a dead frog.
Duh.
Yeah. My wife was like, you're throwing that out, and it was. I felt no magic. It just kind of stank a little bit.
So Craig Griffin says, "I love that part of the story, not the soup." Trespassing in France. He enjoyed that part. I'll stick with that chapter 10 for another moment here, where you close with, what does Apollo mean? And next, Artemis, at least this much, that we fail the promise of the future if we exterminate the past it contains, which takes us back to dear Werner and the Nazis, I believe.
Yeah, I think the space community is big enough and strong enough and clear-eyed enough and science-driven enough to acknowledge those crimes, and the moral compromises that they entailed, and that to treat that as a caution, in that our pursuit of what seems like a transcendent goal, and it was for von Braun, the immortality of the species, he specifically invokes that, becomes an excuse to justify the means, right? The ends justify the means. There's another quote in that book, in my book, from Robert Hughes, great art critic, Australian art critic, who wrote The Fatal Shore and Shock of the New. And he says, and this is just in one of his reviews of, I think it's Albert Bierstadt, or maybe Frederick Church, big American landscape painters.
Yeah.
And he says, to see yourself as a force of history is to be absolved of both pity and guilt. And I think that applies to von Braun. And we could have a discussion about some of the folks who are driving new space and whether they see themselves in that way as well. And I think, actually, at least one of them does. And that is something that we can embrace in terms of conversation and challenges and understanding and having conversations, civil discourse about what it is we think we're doing. And again, I say that as someone who wants us to be there, right? I want us to get to space too. So and if nothing else, there's a lot of irony built into some of that, to the origins of modern rocketry and von Braun and maybe some of what's happening now with, I'll say it, with SpaceX. Yeah.
In the end, though, you're pretty optimistic, aren't you, about the human future with the moon and elsewhere?
I'd like to be, yeah. And I think like all of us, mood matters. It matters what day it is. It matters what the news cycle's been. It matters, what news I've gotten from family. It's like we are creatures of. David Hume says that reason is, the slave to passion. Well, it may not be a slave to passion, but the passions impact how we view these things. But I'm not particularly interested in despair. I mean, the writer David Quammen, an environmental writer, is like, despair is boring. It's like, it kind of is. It's like, what do you do with it? You don't build anything with that. So I'm a little bifurcated, honestly. Like I have a sort of, there's a part of me that has a kind of existential long view that everything's going to wind down, right? Let's talk about the heat death of the universe. Let's talk about the big crunch, right? Let's talk about entropy. It's going to happen. In the meantime, maybe we can, kind of get our stuff together and solve some problems here and solve some problems on the moon. And, I like to, talk with audiences about this and say, maybe on the moon, we'll learn the art of solving problems without creating new ones. And I'd like to think that that's possible. And if it's not, at least we're giving this a try, right? Like at least we're looking inward and outward at the same time in order to better ourselves and to better what is around us. And the last thing I'd say about it as I'm saying this is that looking at the moon and thinking about space travel, I talk with some of my friends who are environmental scientists who are not particularly keen on this idea. I try to talk to them in that way. Like this is a bigger embrace, and it's the same ethos that we bring to trying to navigate the Anthropocene and trying to navigate the difficulties that we have here on Earth. It requires a kind of humility and a kind of boldness, and that's a hard dance, but we should try it.
We have a chance to get it right, I hope.
Yeah.
You consider the many challenges we face, technological, legal, political, and otherwise, as we look toward living and working up there. Yeah. I have to give you kudos for including that conversation, a nice quote from Casey Dreyer, who spent some time with recently on Planetary Society's policy edition, space policy edition.
Yeah.
And you talked about in situ resource utilization and the challenges in that, but you also mentioned in the book, and it's pretty charming, this plant that some people in Florida got to grow in lunar soil, which is very affecting and kind of sublime.
Yeah, it is sublime. That's Annalisa Paul and Rob Furl. Rob Furl is going on a Blue Origin flight. He will fly into space. So they're at the University of Florida Space Plant Laboratory, and they grew little cress, CRESS, cress plants in little vials of Apollo moon dust. And they have been trying for years, to get that permission. They are wonderful, and I think advocates of that sort of sense of the empowerment of space and of our place here on Earth. That those things are brought together. I would say as an addendum to that too, we talked about the Mount Wilson chapter. That was actually not going to be the end of the book. The end of the book was going to be this analog space mission at Biosphere 2, at this facility at Biosphere 2 called SAM, the Space Analog for Moon and Mars, which I did in March. And so it was an all artist mission. Myself, a dancer, a textiles artist, and Julie Swarstad Johnson, the poet. Yeah. The folks at the University of Florida gave me vials, and they gave me lunar regolith simulant. They gave me the crest seeds. They gave me all the equipment. And I had a lunar meteorite ground up into dust. And I got those crest seeds to grow in that as well. So,
oh, that's great. Hands-on.
Yeah, it was my,
like, what would you call it? A green thumb or a gray thumb? I'll stick with green.
I don't know, but it's like I told my wife and friends, it's like I finally feel like I won a science fair project. Like I never got a ribbon in science fairs.
We should wrap up, and I do want to thank everybody for joining us, and certainly, as always, Amber, who has been throwing up these wonderful references, websites that are directly related to or that we have made mention of. Thank you, Amber.
She's got von Braun's home listed here too. It's like a Zillow site or something. Awesome.
And there's so much more that she does for us at the Society. Chris, if you've got it, I mean, I'll do it if you don't want to, but the absolute ending of the book, that last paragraph, if you have it handy, could we close with that?
Yeah, let me get my reading glasses on and get to that page.
And we'll, while he's doing that, I will give you the plug and make the announcement of the August selection in the book club. It's not in focus, is it? That's the smearing here. It's The Music of Space by our good friend, Chris Carberry, the head of Explore Mars. His earlier book was Alcohol in Space, great fun. This one is even better. And this is what you want to grab, folks, because at the end of August or in the beginning of September, we will be bringing Chris on to talk about the rich history, very human history of music of space. All of it produced here, except for the stuff, the music of the spheres. But it's great. It talks about music, pop music and movie soundtracks and great stuff like that. It's a very fun read. So The Music of Space, Scoring the Cosmos in Film and Television, Chris Carberry. You can grab it now, and we'll keep you informed about that, like when we're going to schedule that live event with Chris. The next Chris that we have on the book club. Chris Cokinos, have you got that passage ready?
I have it. So this is the end of the book, and another time we can talk about how hard it is to write endings. So I'm glad you like it. It worked. It was went through many handwritten drafts. Anyway, so here's the end of the book, which is hopefully the beginning of a journey for everyone. When the moon rises between buildings or over trees, it's not just a beautiful sight. It is an archive of human feelings and material truths. The moon is more than a rock. It's a story. It's many stories. The moon signals what came before and what comes after. And I can't wait to look again when the next lunation begins. There is much to see. Known by reason and held by love, the moon invites our gaze and our gasps, the sights and breath of awe, the glow and rhythm of dwelling itself.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, guys.
Absolutely beautiful. Lovely. If I hold it up, it'll be out of focus, but there it is. Still as bright, an illuminating history of the moon from Antiquity to tomorrow. I hope all of you out there enjoyed it as much as I did, and that you enjoyed this conversation as much as I have, judging from the stuff showing up in chat. Apparently you do. Thank you so much, everyone. And Chris, thanks again for a terrific book and the great conversation. I look forward to the next chance to talk.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you, everybody. This is really gratifying and very sweet. A lovely way to end my evening. So thank you.
See the rest of you here in the community. Thank you for your membership. You make this all happen. and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.